Hello everyone, I am John Raymer and I will be concluding our exciting presentation on the events of Fukushima and flexible mitigation strategies by discussing what we can do above and beyond the already existing flexible mitigation strategies to keep ourselves safe in the event of a Fukushima type event occurring within the United States. But John, you say, Mr. Munyon just got done discussing what all flexible mitigation strategies is, and how could we possibly even have a beyond design basis event occur where we found ourselves jeopardizing our ability to maintain continuity of power and remove the latent heat of criticality from the fuel and transfer it to the ultimate heat sink? Well, this is a good point, as emergency safeguard features coupled with flexible mitigation strategies should make that extremely difficult to do. However, in both cases, it is still possible to find yourself in a situation where you wind up with failed fuel and a Fukushima type event. There are certain times where we are particularly vulnerable, and we know this. We know we're vulnerable in some of these scenarios here, and I will discuss them. Here we have a cross-sectional view of a pressurized water reactor containment in the auxiliary building housing the spent fuel pool. Now, anyone who's a licensed operator, or for that matter, anyone who has worked outages and knows a little bit of the sequencing, knows that there are times where we're going and pulling the head off, and we'll go down to mid-loop after we've been critical just maybe a day or two ago, and the time to boil is remarkably low. And in that time frame, if you were to have something such as a mispositioning even, or perhaps the beyond design basis event occur, and you were to lose offsite power and your ability to circulate, or perhaps somehow uncover that fuel, well, you've immediately removed your ultimate heatsink. And you will likely have fuel damage. And you could find yourself in a scenario, equipment hatch shouldn't be pulled at this point, but you get the point. Things can go bad in a refueling outage pretty quick. Flexible mitigation strategies also discusses an extended loss of access to the site. Now, right here we have pictured Fort Calhoun Nuclear Station about 2 months after the Fukushima events occurred. I'm actually in this picture, the speaker, right about here on the other side of our T1 transformer. That's the 4160 transformer coming off this switchyard here. This was a Sunday immediately after we had gone and popped the aqua dam that was attempting to keep the Missouri River, which was at flood stage, from about a half dozen or so dams. Think back to the Oroville Dam disaster that we had earlier this last year and everything that happened there. There was about 6 of those upstream that were releasing water just as fast. We had an aqua dam protecting us, and from this bluff here to the other side of the river over in Iowa is 18 miles of water 3 feet deep. This is approximately 1 mile. Underneath this all is buried conduit emptying everywhere into the plant. And what you don't see is our fuel oil tanks right here and right here, FO1 and FO10, for our emergency diesel generators and our auxiliary boiler. Fortunately, this was in the middle of summer. If it was in the middle of winter, the auxiliary boiler would have to be running, and our ability to get replacement fuel oil from this bluff down here would have been challenged by a large amount of security fence and everything else. Now, we did have some fuel tankers staged on site to help mitigate that, but it's remarkable how close we came to a scenario where we could be affected by an extended loss of offsite power, and we had no means to get this. Fortunately, we were long after a refueling outage, had not started back up, and we had a good time to boil, so we had plenty of time to steer the Titanic away from the iceberg were this to happen. However, this might not always be the case, and it exposed just how perilously close we can come in the United States to having that scale of a disaster. At the end of the day, some might feel that we were, what's a way to put it? We were more lucky than we were correct with how we went about our business. I know the NRC certainly felt that way about it, and it's not necessarily a period of nuclear history that we're proud of. That is what I have to say about Fort Calhoun as somebody who was actively working to mitigate this disaster. Adversaries. When we talk about adversaries nowadays, this is what comes to most people's mind. A group of armed forces attempting to take over a commercial nuclear power plant, fail open the PAL door, and cause a massive release of fission products to the environment for the purposes of causing terror. However, a disgruntled employee is much more likely to also be considered an adversary. Perhaps they are sympathetic to the former group's cause. That could be what it is, or perhaps they're just disgruntled and have something personal to gain from this. there are plenty of people at a nuclear plant that could get in around an outage time frame or other time frame where if a beyond design base event was to occur, uh, they would have the capability of exacerbating that situation. And in all of these events, the common thread is we wind up finding ourselves in a situation where we're much the same as Fukushima. In an earlier video that I had recorded, I went and outlined exactly what the range was around Charlotte or Catawba plant in near Charlotte, North Carolina. And if that was to have to evacuate due to a Fukushima type event, we would be looking at a 50-mile radius encompassing some 2 million people. That is a good reason why we don't want a Fukushima to happen here. But getting back to the topic at hand of Fukushima, we can see that they are already at a certain phase in their life where they have began the process of remediation. They have survived this disaster and they're working to make things better. So they have attempted some things that Flex can look into, one of which is this ice wall. Now, the main purpose of this was to stop the groundwater ingress into their plant and minimize the amount of highly contaminated radioactive waste that they have. So they put this ice wall, and what this diagram doesn't show is the three-dimensional nature of groundwater flow, since this is only two-dimensional. Now, I'm no hydrogeologist, except for that one time when it was up to about my waist at Fort Calhoun there, but this tide is going to affect the way your groundwater flows in and out too at low tide. I can tell you that, having looked at our groundwater results that we have for various isotopes and tritium. During areas of heavy rain, we could see some stuff on monitor wells that we couldn't see at other times, and this is going to be a complicated and highly dynamic situation. But what we have here is a 300 million pound ice wall which fully encompassed the plant. And all it really did was cut down about 10% of the groundwater. Now, that's a minor success, but what TEPCO was looking for here was a 100% reduction in groundwater ingress or egress. And that is not necessarily what they have. So, you'll say, what could we possibly do, that is in the lines of the ice wall, but perhaps not as expensive? Well, we have some options, actually. Now, if we were to have a Fukushima type event occur stateside here, it's a safe assumption that the immediate fallout is going to happen no matter what we try to do about it. We can clean that up later, perhaps, by going and looking at storm sewers and runoff following periods of rainfall and seeing what we can remove for a long-lived isotope from that. And we could look at possibly putting that on ion exchange resin and then solidifying that and putting it underground. And that's an actually really good plan and way to look at it, since the ways we can do that are somewhat scalable. But we will have a large amount of radioactive liquid waste and other contaminated solids on our site as well to deal with. So these are all things to keep in mind, especially if it's going to a big navigable waterway where it feeds into an area where people collect fish or, clams, oysters, or what have you, or perhaps make their drinking water out of that. Now, what we can do, as I've previously discussed here, is we could take an ion exchanger or other filtration, reverse osmosis type of process, and we can remove some of those isotopes, and we can put them into a medium where we trap them in a solid, solidify them, glassify them, turn them into bitumen. Anything we can do to keep this from basically being more readily released to the environment or going airborne is a good way to look at that. We can get to the solid solidification later, and before you actually have a scenario like Fukushima, perhaps we could look at where we could put an on-site waste disposal facility near the affected unit. What's a good area to put that geologically speaking? This is just a simple, it's actually a condensate polishing system that could be used post-outage that a lot of places have seen. Now, an important thing to note here, it talks about your different types of resin. Depending on what you got, if you're dealing with stuff on site, you could want to maintain that boron in there, since you could be looking at actual fuel accumulating outside of the core in the event of a fuel element failure. And then you would want to maintain your boron in order to not necessarily have a reactor in a gooseneck of a pipe somewhere. That would be a bad thing. So this is something to evaluate and consider, especially with this resin. Maybe we don't want to deborate it. Here we have roughly what a condensate polishing trailer is, the size of it. There's about 6 ion exchange vessels in there. Could we accommodate this on Flex? Well, since it is scalable, yes, we could. The trailer is not nearly as costly as that ice wall, and one of the main concerns we will have is the dose coming off of a lot of those ion exchange vessels as we're going and cleaning this up. Plus, if we're solidifying it, are we releasing stuff off? There's a lot of heat generated in that process. Might work, might not work. Here we have a cross section of a potential on-site waste disposal facility. Now it talks about geological site at the bottom. And one of the big reasons we want to look into this now, we don't want to build this site, this is going to be extremely expensive, is because if we have this identified ahead of time, when we have that waste, we're not in the panic mode and we're not going and making that knee-jerk reaction of where are we going to put stuff. It's already surveyed, it's already done, the legwork's done. Any emergency funding you get can immediately be put to a good effective